Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipson. Today's guest is Dan Lust. He's an attorney in the New York City office of Geragos and Geragos. He's also a sports attorney heard on ESPN, CBS, and FOX Sports, giving his take on what's going on in the world of sports law. Additionally, he's a sports law professor at New York Law School, and he is the host of the podcast Conduct Detrimental. Get ready to learn, from a legal perspective, why the NBA player Luka Doncic is suing his mom, about the Formula 1 driver Oscar Piastri situation with Alpine and McLaren, NIL in US college sports, why being a sports fan is not enough to work in sports, and much more. Dan Lust, welcome to Sports Management Podcast.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be on.
It's great to talk to you. And you are an attorney in the NYC office at Geragos and Geragos. I hope I didn't butcher that.
It is what it is. It's Geragos and Geragos, but you got the New York City part, right? So
what are you doing at Geragos?
So I mainly practice, I do a little bit of litigation, which is a fancy way of saying, I guess, well, Marcus, is litigation a term that is transferable across continents?
Yeah.
So at least in United States practice, there's generally two forms of being a lawyer. There's litigation, which is you're suing someone else. And then there's transactional, which is, kind of closing deals and you're working together with the other side to get some type of contractual piece of document done. Could be, some type of record deal, something like that. But I mainly practice in the litigation space. So some of my clients involve entertainers and athletes, and some of them just involve normal people with kind of complex litigation disputes. But my side of the aisle when it comes to law is lawsuits. Someone suing someone else for something. There's a winner, there's a loser, there's usually a judge involved. So, your normal courtroom drama.
I feel like that's more common in the US to sue each other than it is here in Europe.
We're a litigious bunch. But yeah, transactional work. I have family members that work in the transactional space. There's no winners and losers there. Everyone's working on a deal. And if you can, let's say you're working on some type of like real estate deal, everybody's making money on both sides. There's no winner and loser. It's just a matter of how much everyone's getting paid.
That's true. You have done some litigation work, as you said, outside of sports, but you're also a sports lawyer. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do within sports?
Yeah. So, it's funny. I like to kind of say I wear a couple hats. So, by day, really 7 days a week, I'm a lawyer. I go to work and I have normal cases. And then I wear two other hats that, are more firmly in the sports realm. I'm a sports law professor at a law school in New York called New York Law School. So I teach all about legal disputes in the sports realm. Some I give from my personal experience, and others I just give to the history of the sports world. Some, international disputes. We got into, we do some football disputes, some American football, some European football. We do Formula 1. So we talk about really any disputes that are going across the country that we think are interesting in the legal world. And then the other hat, Mark, is probably how I got on your radar. I do a lot of sports media. So I'll go on television and I'll give media hits about, whatever the current story is in our world. I have a sports law podcast called Conduct Detrimental. And yeah, so I go on podcasts like yours. I go on sports podcasts. I go on sometimes I go on Bloomberg's podcast to talk about sports, or Fox to talk about sports. I try to paint myself as being an analyst in everything and everything at the intersections of sports and law.
That's very interesting. And as you said, you are a law professor talking about current events in the world of sports law. So what's going on in the world of sports law?
Well, let me ask you, Marcus, are you a golf fan? I'm trying to figure out what are the big sports in Sweden. Maybe I can find one that your audience will be familiar with.
I'm not a huge golf fan, but I assume that you are referring to the Live Tour versus PGA Tour, right?
It was. Well, I'll kind of give you a window in the eye of the storm and maybe some career advice along the way. I've always been someone who's known a lot about a lot of different sports. So I watch mixed martial arts, I watch soccer, I watch Formula 1, I watch boxing, I watch tennis, I watch a little bit of everything. And I've always, I'm not a big linguist. Maybe I speak a little bit of French, je parle un peu français, and I speak English. But like when I grew up, sports were my universal language. I could pop in an elevator with anyone from any part of the United States, and I would have something to talk about, whether it's their collegiate sports or their pro sports in that particular state. I knew enough about a sport to connect with somebody. And as I've gotten older and the internet has progressed, the same can be true across countries. I know something about something that you're following. I'm sure I can figure it out. I just did a podcast recently on this dispute. I'm not sure if you're following it. There's a very big basketball player, Luka Doncic from Slovenia, who's in this very big intellectual property trademark dispute with his mother. So I don't know if you're from Slovenia, I have that to talk about. But anyone that follows basketball probably knows who Luka is. And anyone that has a mother, I can explain this lawsuit in an interesting way that mother is in the lawsuit with son. I'll find an interesting way to connect with people. So when I've grown up, I'm sure there are people that speak far more languages than I do, but there are far few people that know about as many sports as I do. So I try to say that sports is my cheat code. It's my universal language. It's how I find someone. I can find something through the sports realm. So it could be Luka, it could be Live Golf, it could be Deshaun Watson stuff that's happening in the NFL. It could be Major League Baseball finally agreeing to let the minor leaguers unionize. It's just par for the course. So yeah, I mean, it's fun to say I do this for a living, but that's how I meet people. That's how I get into conversations with people.
Yeah, I'm sure. I was actually aware of all of those things that you mentioned there, but is there anything from this that you mentioned now that you can break down for the listeners?
Yeah, let's do the biggest one. I mean, I'm not sure how many of your listeners are following the National Football League, the saga, but the Deshaun Watson dispute. I'll get into who Deshaun Watson is and the various players involved. And get into a little bit of NFL, the National Football League governance, the rules that took place. I just started the semester for my sports law class about 2 weeks ago. In the first class, I just spoke about this case. That's all I spoke about. This case the case isn't over yet, but from the beginning to where we are now, it gives you a good concept of the civil justice system in our country, which is when someone sues someone else to get money, and the criminal justice system where the state, the state government is suing someone to try to put them in jail. So in the United States, we have the civil justice system, which is to get money, and then the criminal justice system, which is like Law and Order or any famous courtroom drama where someone's going to jail. Marcus, how much time do you want to put in the clock? I can make this as short or as long as you want.
5-10 minutes.
5-10 minutes. Okay. I'll try to keep it interactive, so I'm not lecturing for so long. We have a guy, Deshaun Watson, who I'm familiar that people around the country, around the world, know who Tom Brady is. Tom Brady is the best quarterback in the NFL, probably the greatest of all time. He's at the same levels of Michael Jordan, right? Or Wayne Gretzky, depending on your sport. So Deshaun Watson is he's a quarterback in his mid-20s. He's probably, I want to say, a top 5 to 10 quarterback in the NFL. In the NFL, in the National Football League, there are 32 teams. So he's anywhere, in the top third of quarterbacks. Very good. In NFL football, being that good, being a top 5, top 10 quarterback, that makes you roughly worth like $100 million. That's how much. So it's a very valuable asset. It's someone that teams are willing to pay a lot of money for. This is a guy who took his team to the Final Four of the NFL, and someone that played in the major media market for the Houston Texans for a long period of time. Deshaun Watson was asking his Houston Texans, this is last year, for a new contract. He wanted to play before the 2021 season. He wanted a new contract. Now, before the season started, he was sued by a number of women for sexual assault in civil court. So these women were wanting money in some way, shape, or form. It's not to say anything bad about the women and not to say anything about their credibility one way or the other. That's just what they wanted. They wanted money for a harm that they believed was caused by Watson. So people that are not following this lawsuit or these series of lawsuits, it was essentially allegations, and all of these women, these various women that sued Deshaun Watson, were claiming to be giving Deshaun Watson some form of a consensual massage. Deshaun Watson reached out. He contracted to pay them some amount of money to give him a massage. And these women alleged that the massage went from a normal massage, a professional massage, to something that was unconsensual or non-consensual, that they did not consent to it. So, I don't think this is the forum to talk about how, the messy allegations, but think about how a massage could go from consensual to non-consensual, and that's how you would arrive at sexual assault. So, what was very interesting is the NFL has a version, and if you get sued for something or there's some type of bad allegations about you, what the NFL can do is say, listen, we don't know if these things are right or wrong, if they're true, they're not true, but we're going to pay you your full salary and we're going to have you just stay at home. It's just called paid leave. We're going to pay you, go home, not a big deal. So the NFL did something very interesting, which they don't normally do. They said, well, we're aware that a number of women, and at a certain point, the number rose to 24. 24 women are suing Deshaun Watson for sexual assault. But we're not going to put him on the what they call the commissioner's exempt list, this paid leave list. He's free to play. We're not going to put him on the exempt list. So interestingly, his team at the time, the Houston Texans, they said, well, we're not going to play him, though. Even though the NFL is allowing us to play him, we're not going to play him. So for me, for you, Marcus, anyone that was following this, we're like, well, that's kind of odd. His own team doesn't want to play him, even though the NFL is saying they can. He's one of the best quarterbacks in the entire league. The quarterback is like the pitcher. They're like the center midfielder, the most important position on the team. So it's very odd that they weren't playing him. So you go through the full year and you go, and obviously these cases are now progressing. Meanwhile, the Houston Texans are trying to trade him. They're essentially saying, well, we just don't want him on the team anymore. And again, use your spider sense as to why they didn't want him on the team. But, we're people sitting here like, okay, it's interesting that they're willing to trade one of the best players in football. Yes, the man might have wanted a new contract. He might have wanted to demand a trade, but he's still one of the best players in football and he's very young. So, I'm trying to give this as quickly as I can. There's some nuance, but what teams had said that we're thinking about trading for him, and if people are, European football fans, this is the equivalent of a transfer. So you have a guy who's the very talented player. He wants a new contract, but there aren't teams that are lining up to trade for him. The teams that are saying, well, we're willing to trade for him, they're saying, we'll take pennies on the dollar. We don't want him we're not going to pay full price, but we'll give you a certain amount, of compensation in terms of money and draft picks to the extent that he clears these criminal charges. So at this point in the case, this was March of 2021 when the first lawsuits were filed. At this point, we're in 2022. Maybe it was late 2021, but about 9 months have gone by, 8, 9 months. And the criminal justice system, that other part that I mentioned of our justice system in the United States, hadn't decided whether or not they were going to file criminal charges against him. So, it was kind of an interesting scenario where teams were lining up. They said, well, we'll trade for him if he passes criminal charges. So, no trades were kind of manufactured. And then really on a random, this was what we call a grand jury proceeding in Houston, Texas. A jury of impartial people, just citizens like you and I, Marcus, convened. They were presented evidence about Deshaun Watson, and they said, we don't think a criminal act occurred here. So, then, I don't know, right or wrong, you have 20 plus women that are suing Deshaun Watson in court saying sexual assault occurred. You have a grand jury, just regular everyday citizens that were called to make a decision on a case. They said that no sexual assault occurred. And all of a sudden, as crazy as this sounds, you had a bidding war that ensued between various teams. Okay, he's cleared of criminal charges. We want to have him. We'd love to have him on our team now, which doesn't really look that great because you still have 20 women that are saying that something occurred here, obviously. So fast forward, the team that ended up winning, it's as crazy as it sounds, the Deshaun Watson sweepstakes, they paid him $230 million, a ton of money. They traded 3 first-round draft picks, which in American culture is, the top collegiate players leave and they go to the pros, and first-round draft pick is your first chance to draft one of these collegiate players. So it's a very important asset, first-round draft picks. And then the Browns kind of thought the Cleveland Browns thought they were in the clear. And then before the NFL season started, interestingly, Roger Goodell, who's the commissioner of the NFL, said, well, I know we said we weren't going to put him on that paid leave list before because we didn't think there was enough, but we changed our mind. We think we're going to suspend him for the full season. So what we just had play out very publicly in the last, 2-3 months, the NFL basically put Deshaun Watson on trial, their version of trial, which we call arbitration. And the NFL was arguing for a year suspension. Deshaun Watson and his agents and his lawyers were arguing for no suspension or a lesser suspension. So Deshaun Watson ultimately got suspended for I think the number was 11 games, the final number, and he's going to have to pay, I think, $5 million. So we had, very interestingly, people, I'm happy to talk to people offline, or obviously we covered it on our podcast in my class, but we have the civil justice system that now is still playing out. 23 women agreed to settle their claims. So there's one case that's going to play out. That's a case that's on for trial in April of 2023. We have the criminal case that has since been kind of come and gone. It looks like there's no criminal case. And we have the NFL tribunal that played out, and they heard evidence. They heard oral argument on both sides. And the NFL said, you know what? We think that something wrong happened here. So an 11-game suspension. So Deshaun Watson still being sued in civil court. The NFL thought he did something wrong enough to punish him by 11 games and fine him $5 million. But Marcus, the weird part in all of this, no criminal charges despite all of this. So, it's not really a consistent outcome across our different levels of sports court, civil court, criminal court. People are still saying, well, did he do anything wrong? He's not really apologizing for what he's alleged to have done. So, yeah, it's a great place to kind of explain how the sports court, civil court, criminal court, they all have different burdens of proof, different evidence that can come in. But if you really want a full comprehensive landscape of sports management, sports business, sports law, you kind of have to understand how all these things play into one another.
Yeah, for sure. And you said that you talked about this on your podcast, correct? If someone wants to hear more about it.
We did, yeah. Deshaun Watson, in our podcast, I'm sure we don't have enough time to talk about all the fun stuff, but Live Golf and the Luka lawsuit, it is our job, and for better or for worse, I'm obsessed with all of these things. So I try to learn a little bit about everything. We could talk about, the legal disputes that were going on with respect to Chelsea being sold and Russian athletes losing sponsorships, be it Alex Ovechkin in the National Hockey League. But we try to know a little bit about everything, and we do some deep dives. Marcus, are you a Formula One guy? I have not asked you this.
I like Formula One. I'm like everyone else. I ride the Netflix train, so I've started watching the sport a couple of years. Good. Otherwise, my sport is ice hockey.
Okay. There's some NHL disputes that pops in. We did a lot of Evander Kane stuff in the last year. But yeah, so if anybody's looking for more, obviously we covered it on our show a lot. So there's probably any number of 5 episodes you can find.
That's awesome. Talking about draft picks and college sports in the US, a hot topic lately is obviously NIL. And you are an NIL advisor. So can you give a little bit of an explanation what is NIL and what is it that you advise on?
How much time you want to put on the clock for this one? This one can go very long. I did an hour and a half on it last night. We're not going to do that long now. What do you think? 3 minutes? I can do as quickly.
Okay, 3 minutes.
Okay. Just listen. I could talk all day. I was having a funny conversation with my students last night, and I said, guys, this conversation has to be interactive. I could literally talk for 2 hours, but more fun when we have class participation. In our country for the last 100 years, we've had college sports, and it's a very different model, I should say, which is not very dissimilar to what goes on, in different countries. But the United States, we have an amateur system. So, the best soccer players in the world, and really even, I think it's really any sport, you can play pro, and there's like junior academies, and everyone gets built up through the levels. Soccer is very famous for that. I know even over here, we have like an MLS Next program, which takes guys and gives them some form of stipends and housing and whatnot, and gives them some form of compensation to train these guys to be professionals at the next level. In our country, I don't know which system is better or worse, but you have an amateur system where people play for their high school teams, up until I think they're like 18, and then they play in college between the ages of 18 and 22. And to play in the NBA, the National Basketball League, you have to be 1 year removed from your high school graduation. So basically you're 19, but you have to basically take a gap year between high school and the pros. And in college or in the NFL, they have a rule that you have to be 3 years removed from your high school graduation. So in that period of time before you can go pro, what has gone on for 100 years is that people usually stay in college and they get the exposure of playing for heavy college teams. Now, our legal system in the NCAA, and the NCAA is called the National Collegiate Athletic Association. They're the entity that sets the rules for colleges. They basically said if you're a college athlete and you get paid some form of compensation, you would lose your athletic eligibility. You couldn't play games. So if we find out that you accepted 1 penny, if someone flipped you like a penny or like $1, like at a game, and you accepted some form of compensation, you would lose your eligibility to play in games. So they're very strict. They said, we do not want you to get $1. We want you to preserve your amateurism status. And then when you turn pro and you can go play in the NBA or Major League Baseball or the NFL, go ahead and do what you want. But second you earn $1, you're no longer eligible to play in school. So, but we had this past year really a reckoning, 100 plus years in the making. There's a state, California, that passed a state law. So in our country, obviously, what our 50 states say, it's called state law. State law, if the state tells a private business to do something, the state is in charge. And if the federal government tells a state to do something, the federal government's in charge. The state of California basically said, hey, if you're a school in our state, your athletes can make money and there's no punishment that's going to be given to them. That's the law that we're passing. And people found that to be interesting. Other states started passing those laws. And before you knew it, about 20 states in the country had passed laws that allowed the athletes in their states to earn money. So everyone looked at the NCAA, who at the time was basically saying, well, if you're not in those states, you're not allowed to earn money. So you had this very weird dichotomy where in our country, the colleges compete against each other for what we call the national championship, the top collegiate programs in the world or in the state. You're in there are conference championships within the state or, within the country. And you had different states that were competing under different laws. So in theory, some states could pay their athletes, some could not. And you had very inconsistent laws happening across the country. So the NCAA didn't really know what to do. And they made a decision that said, hey, I guess what we're going to do is if you're in a state that allows you to get paid, we're going to abide by that state law. And if you're in a state that doesn't allow your athletes to get paid, we're just no longer going to punish you for it. So not sure exactly what terms we're going to allow someone to get paid, but every state in the country, every school in the country is going to allow their athletes to be paid with no form of punishment. So for the last year, we've been living in this NIL era, which is called name, image, and likeness. People can now make, we have some athletes earning millions of dollars to play college sports. So that's the world that we're in. It's a very new one. It may be, it may be kind of an oddity that 18, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds are being, in the free market and the kind of schools are bidding for their services. Schools are not technically bidding for their services, but alumni and famous, graduates of those schools are helping fund these particular athletes. So it's a very interesting world that we're in now. And there was never any money involved, at least that people could legally talk about. And an athlete would make a decision to go to a school based on playing time, relationship with the coach, how close the school was to his home, how successful the school is if they were winning. And now maybe the biggest reason an athlete picks a school is because of how much money they're getting paid. I don't know if it is a good or a bad thing. Maybe it's a fine thing. If I had a kid that was 19 and was very good at sports, I'd be all for that. It's just a very different world than college sports has seen in 100 years.
And I mean, doesn't it make sense a little bit with the social media landscape that these athletes are their own brands and that they should be able to make money of that?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, like I can make the argument as to why we had to do this. You have athletes that have 5 million followers or 10 million followers, and it doesn't make sense that they are the only students on the entire campus that can't make money at the thing that they're good at, the thing that makes them famous, right? These name, image, and likeness deals they're not paying an athlete because they threw 30 touchdowns or scored a goal or, anything like that. They're being paid because they have large, they can demand an audience. It's really marketing dollars. These NIL laws don't want to pay athletes and are not allowed to pay athletes for their success on the field. It's basically the attention that they can bring to a particular product. So you're basically being allowed to get money based off your marketability. And it would be very unfair if a musician who was very good at the violin, he could make money. A guy that was really good at TikTok dances or whatever these people do on social media, that person could make money, this person make money. Someone that was good at doing makeup tutorials, they could make money. But the athletes who the school, mind you, is making a lot of money off of, there are television contracts at the collegiate level. Those are the only people, the ones that are helping generate money. Those are the only ones that can't make money. So yeah, there was certainly a dichotomy and an unfairness with that type of distribution.
You mentioned Formula One. So do you have something on that? I can give you 3 minutes on Formula One.
Well, maybe I'll tie it into some college sports stuff too. But Daniel Ricciardo, who is the darling of Formula One and Drive to Survive, the Netflix show. I mean, I started watching Formula One, when the Netflix show popped up. he moves to Red Bull, or he's at Red Bull. He moves over to Renault. And along the way, he's becoming the highest paid guy, one of the highest paid drivers in the sport, despite not being the top driver in the sport. So we did a segment on Oscar Piastri, who is going to be next year's driver. I think it's confirmed now for McLaren. But, Oscar Piastri at the time was involved in his own battle of sports law. Alpine, the team that he was the reserve driver or the up-and-coming driver for, I think he competed, for their minor league team. They announced on a random day, like, we've announced that Oscar Piastri is going to be the driver for our car next year, next to Esteban Ocon. And we're like, cool. I guess that's interesting. Fine. Oscar Piastri, maybe the next upcoming driver in the sport. And then, interestingly, Oscar Piastri comes out with a statement like, that is not true. I will not be driving for Alpine. And I'm like, I have never heard that in the history of sports, that a team, be it in basketball, football, hockey, you name your sport, baseball, announces a signing and on their official, blue check mark verified account. And then the player comes out and goes, that is not true. That is a lie. And I'll be seeking all legal recourse to make sure that's not true. I've never heard that. So, yeah, if people now following the musical chairs, we'll probably discuss it in an upcoming episode. But, Piastri ends up at McLaren. Was left at least temporarily, trying to find a new seat. So we'll see. Is there an update where Ricardo's going? Did I miss this?
Not that I heard.
Yeah, I saw some rumors that maybe Haas and, but it would be very weird if Ricardo is without a seat after being like the most marketable guy in the sport. Maybe he ends up doing broadcasting, but, we could talk like there's sports law everywhere you look. Like Tom Brady just signed a lucrative deal to be the top broadcaster at Fox Sports. And if you're sitting here like, wait, isn't Tom Brady still playing? Yes, he is still playing. That contract kicks in the year after he retires. So you have broadcasting deals. Maybe Daniel Ricciardo is going to do that. But there's really sports law everywhere you look. So sports management's always been a big field. Sports business has always been big. But, for every sports management, sports business story, there was a lawyer behind the scenes working on the story in some way, shape, or form. So, yeah, you name a sport, I'm sure I can find you at least 2-3 legal stories that are going on behind the scenes.
That's very interesting. So from a legal perspective, what repercussions could the team face if they go out and say that the deal is done when it's not yet signed?
Well, the question, the legal action that was happening there, if there was one, would be kind of breach of contract, or what we would call, I don't know what the term would be, because I think Alpine Alpine's French, right? I think it's French.
Yeah, I think so.
I think it was Renault that became Alpine, if I'm
Yes, you're right.
But I'm not sure what the cause of action was there, but there's going to be a different name for it. But in theory, right, Oscar Piastri was a driver that was going up through their system. They put a lot of time, energy, resources into him. And I think they were arguing like, listen, you can't just switch to another team. We put a lot of time and money and invested in you. And I think behind the scenes, and I haven't looked at this in a couple of weeks since it's come up, but I think Piastri is going to argue that you had a right to exercise and have me under your contract. You failed to exercise those rights in a certain amount of time. Therefore, I'm free to go wherever I want. So the dispute would be in what we call, at least in American law, breach of contract. Like Piastri, you can't go to a different team. We control your rights. Same thing that would happen in the National Hockey League for a minor league player, with Major League Baseball with a minor league player. They're developing you as a talent. You can't just leave whenever you want without some fear of some repercussions. So I don't know if we've heard the end of that saga, but yeah, I think almost like, there's only 20 Formula One seats. So for Alpine to announce that they were promoting him is no small thing. It's a huge thing to get a Formula One seat. People will compete their whole careers and never get to the Formula One level. So maybe they were calling, in theory, calling a bluff to some extent, like, hey, we're giving you a seat. So you can say that you can try to sign for McLaren, but that's not a sure deal. Maybe McLaren's not going to want to buy out Daniel Ricciardo and his massive salary. And, you should just take the opportunity that's presented. So it was an interesting legal battle that was kind of aligning, but I think it seems to have sorted itself out.
And in 4 years, there will be 2 more seats when Audi joins, right?
I saw that. Yeah, I guess. I don't know when the next time frame is, but I love to see it. And as someone, listen, I'm in the Drive to Survive era as well, but I did the full deep dive. I did the YouTube stuff. I went down the Senna rabbit hole, the Prost rabbit hole. So, I told you, if I get into the weeds of a sport, I will find it. So yeah, I love to see that there'll be more cars on the grid.
This episode is sponsored by InSport Education, the online business school for sport. They offer a range of different courses, for example, Foundations of Sport Business, Private Equity in Sport, and much, much more. As a listener to this podcast, you get 10% off all of their courses using the code SportsManagementPodcast10. Click the link in the description below and sign up today. Focusing about you and your career, obviously you are a lawyer, so you went to law school, but how were you introduced to this sports industry?
So, I think the story, at least for me, starts, I imagine like most people listening to the show, I grew up as a diehard sports fan. I've always, the analogy I use, I spoke a lot of languages in sports, diehard of all things sport. I got a job for the New York Football Giants. That's the New York's NFL team when I was in college, when I was probably 19, 20. And then, I graduated college and I didn't know if I wanted to work full-time in sports. I wasn't really sure, but at least in like to separate yourself in sports, it usually helps to have some type of additional degree. Get a law degree, or you can get maybe like a master's of sports. And I come from a family of lawyers. So I said, I do want to work in sports. A law degree will probably, that's probably my best bet. I'm very connected in the legal field. And if sports doesn't work out, having a family of lawyers, usually this is a decent field. So when I was at school, law school, I continued to work for the New York Giants, the football team. I did some work in baseball with baseball agencies, some baseball teams. I was the president of our school's sports law society. So I was meeting a lot of people, networking, and just kind of getting my name out. And then, I don't know, sad story. I think there's a story, everything happens for a reason. It was time to graduate. And I had a job lined up with this baseball agency to be one of their lawyers. And they called me, about 2 months before graduation. And they said, well, I know we offered you the job, but, there's been some changes. Our company's getting purchased by a different company, so we can't offer you the job anymore. And I'm like, I would have loved to have heard this news like 6 months ago because I'm about to graduate, but, I'll figure it out. So, for the next couple months, I took as many sports interviews as I could. I had a very good resume, but, these things are very hard to get. I remember I interviewed with, the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. I interviewed with the Indiana Pacers of the NBA. I interviewed with Major League Baseball for a job in the league office. I, flew to different job fairs to try to land something, and I couldn't get anything in sports. So at this point, maybe 6 months have passed legitimately, and I've graduated law school and I have no job. And my wife, my then girlfriend, now wife, kind of turns to me and she's like, listen, you need to be making money. My wife at the time was working for Citibank in finance. And she said, I'm happy that I have a job and I can support us, but like, this is not why you went to law school, to sit on the couch and throw resumes at sports places. Like, if it's meant to be, it's meant to be, but you kind of have to practice law. And I'm like, okay, that was the backup plan. And I guess this is why you have a backup plan. That's why you have a law degree. So maybe this is the boring part of the story, but I went to be a normal lawyer for 6-7 years, just practicing law, trying cases, doing depositions, writing motions, doing the boring legal stuff that doesn't make it onto television. But, being a lawyer, doing the, just normal everyday stuff. So I should mention, and as I obviously, Marcus, I tell the story a good amount. When I was interviewing for those sports jobs, I was getting a lot of interviews and getting to the second and third round. I got to the interview with the New Jersey Devils for the National Hockey League. I didn't get that. So it was like a lot of jobs I was getting to the second and third round for, but I wasn't getting anything. I know. I thought it was odd. And I'm like, I think I'm pretty qualified. I'm pretty smart. Just not getting these. So maybe fast forward, I'm not 7 years into my legal practice. I'm now like 7 years removed from those failed interviews, 7 years removed from the last time I really worked in sports. And I have a mentor at my law firm who basically said, you should, if you're interested in all these sports legal stories, because I've always been, like, there's no one really covering these. And like, what you're covering is really interesting. Like, we would talk at the water cooler and over lunch, and I would explain what was going on. And he's like, you should like maybe write for different websites, or maybe do, start your own podcast. And that was really the impetus. So I took it in my head. that I would be, like the media guy. I'd make it up. There's no position. I wasn't getting paid for it. I would be self-employed. And I'm like, I'll talk about the stories because I find them interesting. And I know the version of me 7 years ago would be obsessed with all these stories. And I didn't have a podcast to turn to back then. So that was really it. And then all of a sudden I was basically a normal, boring lawyer who, when he would go home, would crank up the podcast and be talking about these stories. And I'd write on LinkedIn, where you and I connected. I'd write stories on LinkedIn. I'd write for different websites about sports legal stories. And I started getting called by different radio shows, different TV shows, different law schools to speak on panels. And eventually, I was kind of like a voice in the sports law space, even though I was not doing it paid. I was just doing it for fun. And eventually I sat on a panel with a lawyer at my firm. So you just practice law, you don't practice sports law in your normal day-to-day job. I'm like, no. And I'm like, well, I do litigation. So obviously a lot of these sports disputes have to do with litigation and breach of contract suits with one. So I practice all the stuff. I just don't work with athletes, but I do, I actually practice in the fields that I'm talking about. Just, the sports part's my fandom. So he goes, okay, well, if you'd like, Dan, I could see if there's a job for you over here and you could work with athletes. We do a lot of work with football players and we do some basketball work and different work with baseball entities. And he goes, you could just work for us. You could actually be a sports lawyer, not just a lawyer who happens to cover sports media stories. So that was really it. That was, it wasn't that long ago. It was about 2.5 years ago. So the story, Marcus, which I tell students, I speak to students a lot. Obviously I have students in my class and I speak to people in different shows. The moral of the story is almost like, you want to dress for the job that you want, not the one that you have. I wanted to work in sports law really badly, so badly. And this is going back to the story I was telling you 7 years ago, 8 years ago, whenever it was. I would go to those interviews, with the Devils and Major League Baseball and the Indiana Pacers and the UFC. And they'd be like, why do you want to work for the NBA? And I'm like, well, my dream is to work in sports law. I'd love to be a sports lawyer. It'd be really cool to be a sports lawyer. I love all these sports. And I would approach those interviews like a sports fan, which I don't know. If I was trying to hire a good lawyer, I wouldn't be looking for a sports fan. So the way my story worked out, and again, everything happens for a reason, happy accidents left and right. I became a tried and true, and I learned and I studied to be a tried and true lawyer for 7 years. And I won different awards, like Rising Stars Awards for being a young lawyer in the space. And all of a sudden I looked up and I'm like, wait, now I'm a really knowledgeable sports fan, but I'm a trained practicing lawyer, with 7 years of experience under my belt, with working with some pretty big clients. Now I'm attractive as a sports law candidate. So, the moral of the story is you can't just be passionate about something. You have to have a trait. You have to have a skill. You have to be good at something. But if you're passionate about the thing that, about a particular field, and you happen to be a good lawyer or a good engineer, or, you're passionate about that field, that will help. So passion is never necessarily going to get you a particular job. You always have to have the substantive skills underneath it. So, I couldn't get a sports law job because everybody wanted them. But once I became a tried and true lawyer who also happened to know everything about sports and had made some rounds in the media, it's then all of a sudden I was an attractive sports law candidate because it wasn't just form over substance. Then it was substance and form. I kind of had both. So, that was the moral of my story, happy accidents. And I don't think I would be as good of a lawyer, as trained as a lawyer. I don't want to say as good of a lawyer, but had I gone right into sports, I would have done it as a sports fan. I would have learned it backwards. So, I think the way everything worked out was how it was meant to be.
And of course, you have gathered more experience this way. And I love what you say that it's not enough to be a fan. In a job interview, you need to find something that makes you unique and that you can help these companies with. And being a sports fan is not, setting you aside from anyone else who's applying for a job in sports.
Yeah, I tell the story at least to any young lawyers that are listening to this or people that know, have the kids that want to be lawyers or friends. The truth is I can just tell you I'm a lawyer and that helps in sports. The one thing, if there's one field of sports that is very applicable to a particular legal field, it's employment law. Because at the end of the day, we can call our athletes superheroes and gods, and they're our heroes and whatever else, but they're really just employees at the end of the day. So if you really were a master of employment law, and I know a couple people that have been hired in sports, having been normal everyday employment lawyers, but they know a lot about the industry of sport, that would make them a very attractive sports law, candidate. So if they want to work for the league and they have to deal with their employees. You kind of need to know employment law, and certainly helps to understand who your most important employees are if you're a fan of the particular sport. It helps if you're an agent, right? It's also some form of labor and employment law. So yeah, I have a lot of students that ask me what's the biggest field that I should know about to set me up for success to transition into sports. I'm like, as boring as it sounds, take a boring class on labor and employment law, learning about strikes and lockouts and demanding more money from your employer, right? That's sports law. I mean, that's contract negotiation. That's that Oscar Piastri lawsuit that we spoke about. That's Deshaun Watson. If an employee does something wrong, what are the ramifications of doing it? So yeah, if you're trying to pick one field, employment law is probably the best way to go.
I actually had a sports lawyer on a couple of months ago. He was from Spain and he had exactly that journey. He was an employment lawyer who transitioned into sports because he liked football. And now that has helped him tremendously in his current position.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but I've been around the block a couple of times, and at least the success stories I've seen, you could be an immigration lawyer, you could be a real estate lawyer, tax lawyer. I've seen all of those people make a transition to something in sports, crypto, NFT. I've seen it, but by and large, it's employment. So again, I took employment, labor and employment, Marcus. I hated the class. It was not something that I found that interesting, but I'm like, I have to learn this for sports purposes. So you got to grind your teeth. And if it's really your dream to work in sports, the best route as a lawyer to get in is certainly employment law.
Your journey is fantastic. And I really like how you overcame all of the hurdles. You took a side path before getting back on the main road into sports as you wanted to. But is there something that we haven't talked about yet that you would like to mention?
I mean, the truth is, I guess I'll tell you this, and this is for sports management. I could give this advice to college students, sports business students, or sports law, sports management. It doesn't really matter. People can look at my resume and yes, I worked for the Giants and I worked for these teams, but it's sometimes the things that I don't put on my resume that are the most important ones. I did work, and Marcus, you can make fun of me for the story if you'd like. You're certainly more than welcome to. When I was at the sports agency, they had asked at one point, does anybody want to run our Twitter account? And I said, yes. I'm like, I'll run the Twitter account. What do I have to do? And they're like, when one of our athletes is playing and tweet out when they do something interesting or a fun fact, I'm like, that sounds like a lot of work. Am I going to be paid more than that? And they're like, no. But it was something that you learn a lot. You learn about the grind. You learn about putting hours, and you're learning about just saying yes and loading up your plate. So when I say I worked for the sports agency, I was a lawyer, but I went home and I was working on that, right? And then there was this one you might make fun of me for, maybe. I learned through running this sports agency's Twitter account, which was a kind of, a blue check mark account. It was a big account. I learned how to use social media in a way that certainly helps me in my practice now. I do a lot of social media marketing. I was once at a food truck festival, a lot of different startup food companies. And I once met a company that was making these little mini cheesecakes. Marcus, do they have cheesecake in Sweden?
Yeah, for sure.
Do they? I don't know if cheesecake is a one.
I think that's universal.
So, New York, we have New York style cheesecake and there's Italian cheesecake. I've never heard of what type of cheesecake do you have? Just Sweden cheesecake?
We just call it cheesecake. I don't know the difference, to be honest.
Oh, so when you come to the United States, you'll see there's two different types, at least here. Maybe there's, but I said to this company that your product is amazing. Like, I'd love to be involved. Like, what do you guys do? And they're like, it's just us. And I'm like, well, if you need someone to help look at contracts, and I'm a law student. I think I was 20, and I signed up to work with them. And then I helped them randomly. Like, I would go home, I would do my sports law stuff, I would help with the agency's Twitter account, and then I would look at cheesecake contracts. So I didn't get paid any money for that. I didn't get any equity. But I just learned to kind of keep my hands dirty. So if someone comes to you with an opportunity, hey, do you want to help with this? Your first question shouldn't be how much am I going to get paid for that? Just get the experience, and it'll all make sense later on in time. But you want to, by the time that you're ready to hit the workforce, by the time you're 20, 22, 23, you're going to need to get paid for your services. But when you're younger, when you're in your early 20s and your teens, just do as much stuff as you possibly can. There will be plenty of time to have downtime and go out with friends and drink and go to the bar. But, I constantly always loaded myself up with things. So, yeah, that would be my advice. Be an entrepreneur, be your own boss, and don't worry so much about getting paid early on in your career. It'll come. Just you want to make sure you're building up all those skills.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Final question. If you could choose the next guest on this podcast, who do you think that I should talk to?
It's a good question. Can I pick another lawyer? Is that allowed?
Yeah, for sure. If it's a sports lawyer, it needs to be related to sports.
I'll tell you a good story. You ready for this?
I am.
And this will set up for your next guest, and you can have her tell the story. I'm pretty sure she'll come on. She's a friend of mine. So I have, I'm not that old. I'm 30, turning 34 this year. I have mentees. I have mentors. So I'm, kind of in the early phases of my career. One of my mentees was someone that worked for me. Her name is Stephanie Weissenberger. She worked for me once upon a time. I told her, I'm like, hey, just get your name out. Good things will happen. You got to write. I want you to go speak where you can, but writing. She wrote a story about Giannis Antetokounmpo's lawyer, how he was doing a lot of interesting things in terms of enforcing Giannis's trademarks. He's known as the Greek Freak for those that don't know, the NBA. And people were making these counterfeit shirts that said the Greek Freak or Giannis. And this guy would basically sue everyone. If you had a shirt, even if you were Marcus and it was like, or me, like just random people, he'd be suing everybody. And Stephanie wrote a story about how interesting and how aggressive this guy was being with trademark, but that was what you need to do if you have a trademark, it needs to be protected. So it was a very kind of, a good story about this lawyer. So Marcus, I get Google alerts whenever somebody writes my name anywhere. Apparently this lawyer did as well. This lawyer saw that someone wrote a story about him. It was very obviously a story that was written in a positive light. And this lawyer called up Stephanie, who was, young lawyer, and basically offered her a job to work at a law firm that does NBA. So Stephanie's a really good success story of someone that got a job by putting himself out there in some way, shape, or form. Writing an article, doesn't know if anyone's going to read it, but power of the internet, you do not know who's reading anything at any point in time. So, I'm happy to make an intro for her. And Stephanie is one of my favorite people in the field and someone who I think has a very bright future.
Thank you. I would really appreciate that. It sounds like a brilliant guest.
Yeah, I'm happy to make the connection. We can talk offline. I'm happy to send it to you.
Dan Lust, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the Sports Management Podcast.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @sportmpodcast.